Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've been sharing the video of these conversations now and getting some nice engagement. Definitely still follow us. And if you could go and find the Apple review button and leave us that review, it really does make a difference. You can join our Patreon and get the coffee mug and some other TP&R swag. And we have links to all this in the show notes to make it really easy to find. It really does help so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Rabbi Sharon Brous. Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading-edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles, and author of The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World. It's so good to be with you. Thank you for doing this, Rabbi Brous. How you doing?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be with you, Corey.
Yeah. You know, I thought a really good way to start is if you could tell us, and forgive me if I'm not getting this, the way to reference it correct, Mishnah Middot. Is that the right way to reference it?
Yeah, you got it.
So one of a short quote, and then I'd love for you to expound, is all who entered the Temple Mount entered by the right, circled to the right, and exited by the left, except for one to whom something had happened, who entered and circled to the left.
So this is a fairly obscure Mishnah. Mishnah is an ancient Jewish compendium of law that was codified about 1800 years ago, so very old text. And this Mishnah describes a pilgrimage ritual when Jews used to come from all across the land, and they would go up to Jerusalem on the holiest days, and they would ascend to the top of the hill in Jerusalem, a city on a hill. They would climb up the steps of the Temple Mount, which is the holiest place in the holiest city, and they would enter through this arched entryway. And as you said, they would turn to the right, and hundreds of thousands of people would walk around that courtyard of the Temple Mount together, collectively as part of their pilgrimage, except Misha Ero Davar, someone to whom something had happened. That person, the brokenhearted, would enter and they would turn in the opposite direction. And you would have this dynamic where literally the people who are mourning, who are ill, who are bereft, who are bereaved, who are lonely, who are brokenhearted, would be walking in one direction while the whole world is walking in another direction.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful ritualization of what we instinctively feel when we are not okay, when we're brokenhearted, as if everybody's going one way, we're going the other way. And this sacred encounter would occur in which the Mishnah, in this very terse language, says that one of the people who's walking from the right looks into the eyes of the person who's walking from the left, the brokenhearted, and simply asks Malakh in the ancient Hebrew, which means, tell me about your heart. What happened to you? What happened to you? And the person would answer saying, this is why I'm broken. It's been 3 months since my loved one died. I just need someone to tell me my kid's going to be okay. And then the person who's coming from the right would offer a blessing, something like, may the one who dwells in this place hold you with love as you navigate this difficult time. May you know that you are surrounded by blessing, even in the dark of night, something like that. And then they would go on their way. And what struck me after sitting with this text for many years is that in many ways, the power of this ancient ritual, it's so simple and really unexplained in the law code. The power of the ritual is that none of the parties who are involved actually want to be having this encounter, because the person who's not okay that day, which we've all been not okay, we've all been the brokenhearted one, the bereft, the bereaved, the ill. Sometimes you don't even want to get out of bed. The last thing you want to do is show up in a place where the whole world is moving against you. And yet they have to go, and they can't go and pretend that they're like everyone else, turn to the right like everybody else. They have to visibly show on the outside that they're not okay. It counters every instinct in our bodies. And the people who are okay, who that day are turning to the right and they're there for their sacred purposes, the last thing they want to do is stop, pull away from their friends and their loved ones and their community when they're in the midst of this holy, sacred pilgrimage practice and check in on a stranger who looks like they're not okay and say, "Hey, man, what's going on? What's happening to your heart?" And yet they do that. And the person who's bereft or brokenhearted trusts that when they share their broken heart, they will not be disgraced or mocked or humiliated. They'll be held with love. And the person who's doing okay makes that promise to them: I will receive your pain with great care and compassion. And it just strikes me that that's such a powerful model for how we need to turn toward each other at exactly the moment that our deepest instinct is to pull away from each other. Instead, to turn toward and to see the humanity in each other, to see the pain that one another's holding, and to hold it with curiosity and with compassion and with care. So that ritual becomes the foundation of the book, and all the chapters of the book are rooted in different aspects of unpacking what it means to be the person who's always moving to the right, and whether by profession or, by personality, by character, is always looking up to see who's in pain, who's in need, and how does that pain start to live in our own bodies. All different aspects of this question. How can we find a way to allow ourselves to be so tenderhearted and so vulnerable, and trust that we'll be held with love? What are the responsibilities of community so that we can build spaces where people know that our responsibility is actually to see each other in precisely these moments?
You know, I have so many other questions for you, but sharing the background of that ritual, I have a question. And one of the best Bible studies I've ever read was actually written by John Steinbeck. And it's a great novel called East of Eden. And I think it's on Genesis 4, if I remember correctly. And part of a huge part of the book, or huge thread in this wonderful novel, is studying this verse: "Sin is crouching out the door, and thou blank overcome it." And they grapple with whether the right translation with is of that word is "thou must overcome it," like a lot of fundamentalists. It's a command. "Thou will overcome it," like say some pastors, the name it and claim it wealth gospel, a promise. The conclusion that Steinbeck's characters come to is the best translation is "thou mayest overcome it." A very nuanced treatment of that word that also involves our participation in the project, right? I wanted that as I've grown older, I wish that Steinbeck wrote another volume of that book to do a study of the word sin, because
Mm,
I think that many of us get confused or have too too we're containing that word sin in one sense of it. But I think of it this way: as you were discussing the background on that Mishnah, uh, that sin is almost like this monster, right? That I know that it's partly separation from the ideal or what have you, but in my instance, I've struggled with mental illness most of my life, and to me, that's what that is. It's this monster that's with me. That's a burden on me, and it's the reason that it's hard to get out of bed in the darkest seasons is that everyone can see it.
mm.
So I'm curious if you have any insights into that word, a better understanding of that word, and am I onto something there in what I suspect about that, how we're translating it?
Well, I have a different read of what sin is, which we can talk about, but let's go first to your read, which makes me ask, what if everyone could see it, but instead of shaming you for it or stigmatizing you for it, embraced you with love, even still? How would that change your understanding of the monster crouching at the door, right?
Yeah.
If we knew and trusted that coming forward and saying, the thing that I'm most afraid of you finding out about me is a part of me. And then if the response was not to distance from you because of that thing, but instead to just hold you, So it makes me think about there's a midrash, this ancient rabbinic commentary about the end of the sixth day of creation before they were cast out of Eden. And so Adam and Eve are created, and the animals are created. They spend the whole day kind of frolicking in the garden and naming the animals, and then the sun starts to set because it's the end of the sixth day, but it's the
Right.
first time they've ever seen darkness.
Right.
Adam freaks out because he's never experienced darkness before. And he does the thing that we do when we experience darkness, especially for the first time, which is first he blames himself. He says, "What did
Mm.
I do to deserve this?"
Yeah.
And then he catastrophizes and he says, "This darkness must mean that the whole world is ending, that it will never get light again." He has no concept of the, the cycle of day and night. He only knows that darkness has come in. And Eve, he's so Adam starts to cry and then he's wailing and then he's fully thrashing around and screaming. He's utterly terrified. And Eve, who was created to help him by standing opposite him, his Ezer Kenegdo, she was created in order to be his partner by sitting across from him, comes and sits Kenegedlo across from him and just holds him throughout the night. And they cry together. And she never says it's not your fault because she doesn't know if it's his fault. And she never says there's going to be a dawn in the morning. You just wait and see it's going to be okay because she has no idea if it's going to be okay. She's
Right.
never experienced the darkness either. She must be terrified herself, but she's just willing to hold him in his deep sadness and terror of the night until the dawn does reemerge. And so I think that part of the reorientation for us is, what if we don't have to hide the part that we're most afraid of, but instead can find a person or people in the world who are not going to run away when they're exposed to that brokenness, and instead can sit with us and say, "Hey, I'm broken too. Maybe I'll just sit with you through the night, through the hardest time. And then if you feel ready to get up in the morning, we'll get up in the morning. And if not, we'll just stay here for a little bit longer."
Mhm. Are you asking me the question, or because I have more questions for you?
Go ahead, go
I
ahead.
I think thinking about that possibility, I think that it would be like a language I didn't speak. And I'm
Mm.
not sure, depending on the day, what my reaction would be. If there would be a harsh reaction, almost as if I'm reacting to toxins, because that reaction is alien to me. So my body doesn't know how to react to it. But it's just something I didn't recognize. There's a friend of Lisa Sharon Harper's, a mutual friend of ours, who wrote a book called Fierce Love. She's a pastor in New York City,
I
and
know him well.
yeah, she describes a scene with her grandchildren, and there's a very specific kind of love, a delight. I think is I don't know if she used that word or if it's the word that occurred to me as I was reading the encounter, and it was heartbreaking in a way because the way she gazed upon her grandchild in that story is not something that I recognized being the subject of, right? So yeah, so that's but then again, if I am in that situation, maybe I'll have a completely different reaction. So an example of when that kind of happened was about a year ago. I had one of my favorite writers in the world on, a fellow named David Brooks, whose book came out, How to Know Each Other, I think is the title off the top of my head. Um,
How to know a
and
person, I think.
How to Know a Person. Thank you.
Yeah, how
Yeah.
to know a person.
Yeah. And I thanked him for the chapter he wrote about his friend that succumbed to depression. Um, and I didn't want to talk about it for reasons that we're actually discussing right now. And he said, "Man, that looks like that really touched you. Can you tell me about that?" I bawled my eyes out.
Oh,
There's 10 minutes of this conversation that I couldn't share. It was just, it wasn't, no one would comprehend any words other than, me boo-hooing the whole time. There was a part of it that we ended up sharing because I felt it was important, more so his sympathy and his inquisitiveness. But
mm.
maybe that's the answer to your question is my, you know, my body didn't know how to do that moment. And all it could do was just cry my eyes out.
Right.
So,
I think there's a beautiful Jewish teaching that says that our bodies are full of bone and muscle and blood and water. And when something happens that forces us to assimilate a new reality into our systems, we cry because it's our body's way of making space for a new reality to come into the system. And so sometimes we have to cry a lot in order to assimilate a reality because we don't want to assimilate that. We don't want to make room for it. So we have to push out a lot of water in order to make space for it. But I wonder if, on some level, what his grace in just acknowledging the power of being seen like you and touched like you were when you read about his friend, um, the act of being seen by him made you cry because your system had to make space for that. We don't have
yeah,
room. There's no empty space in our bodies. Everything's full. So you had to expel tears in order to make room for the fact that, my God, David Brooks just saw me.
it's
Right? Like,
crazy.
I
Yeah, it
mean,
was crazy.
literally like a person, but also David Brooks just
Yeah,
saw it.
yeah,
And I mean, I think there's something to that that's so important for this conversation, which is, we all have different neural pathways in our brains, which are established really early on. And sometimes they're really beautiful patterns that are established in early childhood. And sometimes they're really pained patterns. And it's really hard to create new neural pathways. And yet we can create new neural pathways and new spiritual pathways. And part of the way that we do that is by serving others in the way that we want to be served in the world, and then by receiving love when it's given to us, and actually accepting that when somebody says to you, Malakh, tell me about your heart, that
yeah.
they mean it, and that it would be safe for you to say, I'm brokenhearted because I don't even feel safe answering your question, right?
Right.
And that is a kind of transformation that doesn't happen overnight, but that we can experience if we allow ourselves to.
Well, one of the reasons I felt bad about that encounter was it was a little embarrassing, but I felt it was unfair for me to put that on him, to put him in that situation. This new friend, this person that I respected who didn't know me from Adam. And it's related to a thought that occurred to me throughout the book, The Amen Effect. As I was reading, I thought, wow, how heavy is that burden that someone like you carries in a place of leadership? Um, is it is it is it just this endless source of endless resource that you can continue to draw upon, or does it just continue to weigh upon you as a leader, and bearing others' burdens? That 1/60th that you talk about, does it start to add up and become too heavy?
Yeah, yes and yes is the answer.
Yeah,
So I'll explain the 1/60th, which is there's this ancient formula for that says that when you visit somebody who's not well, you can take 1/60th of their pain away. Each visitor that comes can take 1/60th of their pain away. Now, even if 60 visitors come, they can't take all the pain away because it just doesn't work like that. But you can take 1/60th. In other words, it's small enough that it's almost negligible, but it's something. It's a little something. And the question that I ask in that chapter is, but where does all that pain go? And what happens when you are a hospice worker, a teacher, a rabbi, a minister, when you're a therapist, when you're a social worker, when your job is to receive 1/60th of this person's pain and then this person's and then this person's, at some point, can we not fill up with other people's pain? And I think we can fill up with other people's pain. I think that the idea of secondary trauma is very real, and vicarious trauma. We don't talk about it a lot because it's embarrassing to talk about because we're caregivers. That's our work. Even if it's not your job, we all know people who, like, they're the first to show up with lasagna, right? When
right.
somebody, but like they see themselves, we see ourselves as caregivers. And so it's embarrassing to then talk about how you're in pain from all these other people's pain that lives inside you. But if we don't process that pain, then as my sister Dev says, if you don't metabolize it, it will
Mm,
metastasize inside of you. If we don't process that pain with each other, find healthy ways to let it come in and out of us, then it will stop us up. And in fact, I'll just share with you very personally that that when in the last week of my father's life, he was on hospice, and we had the most extraordinary hospice team. And there was one hospice nurse in particular, he called himself Big Art, and and he was there every day the last week of my dad's life. And I said to him, Art, like, how do you do this? You literally only meet people when they're in the final stage of life, and you kind of fall in love with them. Like, he loved our family. He loved my dad. Like, you invest so much in us, and you know he's going to die in a couple days. And he described how when he leaves each house, he he just like he pushes it out of him so that he can go home and be present with his family and go to the next patient and be present with them. Like, he formed his own system of metabolizing the pain. And so the answer is yes, it can build up in us and just stop us up. Like, too much kindness, too much goodness, too much showing up can actually hurt us. And so we have to be really careful about that. And I found that one of the most powerful things we can do is literally just talk about it.
mm,
Literally be willing to say to someone we love and trust, that was a lot. I'm dealing with a lot right now. I had one of the hardest days of my life was the day that I buried two kids in our community who were killed by a drunk driver. We buried these two kids. And while we were in the midst of the burial, my sister-in-law gave birth to my niece.
mm.
And so we finished the burial. I washed my hands and I got in the car and drove to the hospital to meet my niece, who was an hour old by the time I met her. And my sister-in-law handed me the baby and I held her in my hands. And as I was holding her, I saw my fingernails, and the earth from the
Oh,
burial was still in my fingernails.
yeah.
And I thought, my God, like, you can't just go from this to this to this to this to this. Like, it takes a toll at some point. It takes a toll. And so, yes, we have to help ourselves by sharing that so that we're not allowing it to metastasize in our system. But the other side of what you asked is that every single person at some point in life walks to the left.
Yeah.
Every single one of us. For some people, they walk too many times to the left. It's not fair. They have too much loss. For some people, the first time they walk to the left is when they're 60 years old and they lose an elderly beloved parent for the first time. We experience the weight of walking to the left differently, but everybody walks to the left at some point. And once you realize that, then you realize that part of what it means to be in relationship, in community, is that sometimes you walk to the right and you have a little bit more strength in you and you can help the people walking to the left. And sometimes you walk to the left and it's okay to be held in those
Mm,
moments. Because this is part of what it means to be in a sacred collective, whether that's in a church or a mosque or a synagogue, or whether that's in a book group or in the library, or in the grocery store. Like, if we build communities of real sacred responsibility, that means, like, when I'm not okay, I have to trust that I'm going to share it with someone who will receive me tenderly, because I know that I would do the same for someone else. And there's a lot of vulnerability in that. But we also know from from Henry Nouwen and the Wounded Healer that we can't actually help anyone unless we're willing to acknowledge our own vulnerability.
right, right. And there's a lot, having gone to IKAR, and I look forward to joining you again and hopefully bringing my wife Lisa. I noticed things. Now, this might just be my ignorance because I only went to my own shul growing up, to my Zayda's shul in New York, and a couple others through doing NCSY, Shabbaton. So I might be limited in terms of my experience at synagogues, right? But I noticed a couple of things. One, the seats are arranged in a semicircle. Was that a choice just, or was that just something logistical that just kind of made sense? Or
It's a
is
choice.
there's more
It's a choice.
philosophy?
Yeah. I wanted that everybody in the room could see somebody else in the
Mm,
room and be
yeah.
seen by somebody else in the room. Prayer is both a private experience and also a public and shared experience. And so I want people to be able to access the depths of their own broken hearts and full hearts. But I also want everybody in the room to be able to see and feel that if we're paying attention, there's always a mourner in the room. And there's always somebody who's celebrating new life. There's always somebody who's just had their heart broken and somebody who's just fallen in love. And that's part of what it means to be in community, that moves us beyond our own personal heartache and our own personal joy into a sense of kind of collective responsibility for one another. So I designed the room so that we pray in a big basketball court in our
Yeah.
community currently. So we're in a high school gym. But that means that there's total flexibility. And I said from the beginning, when we started IKAR 20 years ago, I said, my one requirement for the space is that we have to have no chairs rooted to the ground. I want to be able to experiment and move and take people by surprise. And I want to try different things so that we can feel what's right. And we very quickly came to a kind of almost full circle
Right.
in the room because I really wanted people to be able to see and be seen. And I think this is really at the heart of what spirituality is to let ourselves see each other and be seen by one another. So that's why we set up the room that way.
There was something else, and I don't know. I think it was the Mishnah Middot, which I'll let you describe what that special prayer is. Was that done, several people going one-on-one to individual folks with
Yeah.
needs? Okay.
Yeah.
That's a little different than what I'd seen. At Chabad, they do via haste and you do another
Yeah.
prayer for somebody who's sick. So is that something that's done commonly, or is that something unique
No,
to IKAR?
this is something I made up. So, no, I know what it's like to have someone you love who's not well and the burden that we carry when we are really worried about somebody in this world. And so what we do is there's a time, this part is very normative in Shabbat services to say a prayer for healing. But what I decided early on was that the most powerful thing we could do is pause for a moment in the middle of the prayer and then have the rabbis and healers in the room. There's some chaplains, some social workers, some therapists actually fan out throughout the room. People stand if they have someone who they're holding in their heart, or if they themselves are in need of healing. And then one by one, we just ask them, who are you holding? And they say, I'm holding my mother Miriam, who's struggling with cancer, or my neighbor's son just was in a terrible accident, and I really pray that he recovers. And they say the name, and I repeat the name back to them. So there's a kind of sacred dialogue that's happening where first somebody sees you, that you're holding the weight of worry for somebody else in this world. Then they ask you, I mean, we're essentially enacting this ancient ritual. Tell me who you're holding today. And then we pay attention to somebody saying the name of their loved one. We say the name back. Sometimes I get the name wrong when I say it back. I can't hear it, or it's a complicated name. They say no, and then they correct me, and then I say it again. And I'll keep doing it until I get the name right. And then often we hug, we hug. And I think the power of it is that it's seeing the individuals and recognizing that, that meme that says, be kind. You have no idea what kind of storm is raging beneath the surface of another person. And it's just true. I mean, we're just a room of 400 or 500 people, but some of those people are truly brokenhearted. And so how can we lift up the fullness of the humanity of every person in the room? Well, by seeing them and by letting them know that they're seen. And as I've held people who I've really loved who were not well, and then given the name to others, it's so powerful to hear my loved one's name being shared back to me by someone else. And just being acknowledged as a person who's holding a lot that day. And I think that is kind of transformative for somebody who's experiencing that kind of fear and uncertainty as a loved one struggles.
One of the other aspects of the service, I got there at 9:30, and I wrote down a note about 20 minutes in, and I said 20 minutes in, and the drum beat at about the pace of a heartbeat has hardly stopped. Is that part of what enters us into, because that's before the Torah service, is that part of what enters us into that moment together, that prayerful ritual moment? Or is that just because folks are, and by the way, the harmonies are just fantastic. I didn't know Jews could sing this well, at least not in my shul that I grew up in.
Look, I mean, I wanted Shul to be beautiful. I wanted it to be inspiring, and I wanted it to be surprising. I am, I'm a student of Abraham Joshua Heschel, as so many, rabbis of my generation are. His work really was very transformative for me. I was born the year that he died, but his
Oh,
work was most formative for me. And he speaks about prayer. He says, synagogue has become the graveyard where prayer is buried.
oh,
Like the synagogue service is so devoid of life and joy and pain. And it becomes this kind of perfunctory, like, start on page 12 and get to page 212, and then we can go have, lunch. And where's the space for tears? And for me, I mean, it's music that makes me cry. I just had this experience yesterday where I heard a song and I just burst into tears. And I even said to my husband, why, I texted him saying, why does this song always make me cry? And like, I don't know why. It's not the words. It's like so what we wanted to do was capture some of the power of music to break our hearts open, and also to get us dancing, and get us off our butts and standing up and moving around if we can. And um and I wanted us to be taken by surprise. I wanted us to feel like that we didn't always know what was going to come next in services. Now, so I'm a little bit traditional. Where it's not an Orthodox community, but all the prayers are in Hebrew. And and I am not a person who uses musical instruments on Shabbat. Um, and so when we started the community, which is really kind of an outreach community, and there are some observant Jews like me. There are people who are, identify as modern Orthodox. We had one Haredi, one ultra Orthodox guy who used to come for many, many years. But a lot of our people are kind of very much on the margins of Jewish life and not observant. And so people really wanted instruments and like guitars and piano. And I said, I had this instinct it wasn't right, because according to Jewish law, more traditional interpretations of Jewish law, you wouldn't do it, but also because I didn't want the instruments to take the place of the human voice. I wanted us to sing together. I wanted us to sometimes start in the wrong key, and then laugh and then fix it. I wanted it to be like very human and raw and real, as a way of like allowing us to experience some of what prayer could be. And I wanted the drums because of the heartbeat, because I wanted to sort of mimic externally what was happening internally. And so exactly what you felt 20 minutes in is exactly what we intended. And that's why we have drums and not other instruments. And because it also takes people by surprise, because they're like, oh, this is a very traditional prayer service, but why are there drums? But it doesn't seem like some hippie, drum circle. But also I kind of like the drum, like it's kind of an interesting tension between what it is and what it isn't.
yeah. There were a couple things that I'll say were disconcerting. One of which is just a question. I noticed that non-bar mitzvah age kids were up doing the aliyah, the bracha before the Torah portions. Is that, for lack of a better word, is that kosher?
You're really getting in the weeds here. I wouldn't call up a kid who's not yet of the age where they're able to officially have an aliyah, but sometimes people come up to join up at the Torah table with whomever is called up. So if the parents are called up of a bar mitzvah, for example, the little siblings might come up and join,
Okay.
so that I can give a blessing to all of them, but they wouldn't officially say the blessing until they're at that age.
Okay. All right. So the other one that was disconcerting, and this is more of a confession. I'm confessing to my Archie Bunkerish tendencies. Um, so I'm not used to having grown up, Orthodox synagogue, not used to women wearing talis and yarmulkes and a preponderance of women in leadership. So my question though is, in recent years, I felt that even asking these questions and admitting to the fact that that was disconcerting, it wouldn't be a hospitable conversation. So that's why I'm bringing it up with you because there's nobody here to punch me.
I guess it depends who you bring it up to.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
pretty I'm grateful for the question, actually. I mean, we've gone through a transformation in Jewish life over the course of the last 40 years. And when I will just admit to you that when I was a kid, our Reform synagogue hired its first woman rabbi. And
Mm,
I remember sitting there as a child going, that's not right. That's a man's job. And I mean, I felt viscerally uncomfortable because it felt inappropriate to me as a child. Okay. So when I was ordained, which was 2001, there were 120 women rabbis in my entire movement. I was ordained by the conservative movement. There were more in the reform movement, but not that many more. Maybe three or 400 women rabbis in the whole world at that time. Now there are more, but not that many more. I mean, maybe there's 400 in the world, maybe 500. So, so things have changed pretty dramatically, and now even in many Orthodox circles, there's a yeshiva that trains essentially women rabbis. They're called Maharat. They
mm.
made up a name that means because some people aren't comfortable with them being called rabbi or rabbah. So they made up a new name, but they're essentially serving as rabbis. They're preaching, they're teaching, they're leading, they're answering halachic questions of Jewish law. So things have changed fairly quickly, and I feel excited to be part of that movement. I mean, there was a time early on at IKAR, which I founded IKAR. I was the founding rabbi of IKAR. I founded IKAR with a small group of founders. And very early on, one of our founders famously said, I love our rabbi and I want her naming all of my babies and doing all of my life cycles and preaching every Shabbat. But as soon as we have the money, we have to hire a male rabbi because we need someone with some gravitas.
Oh, wow.
So he famously said that. So then this is going to sound very obnoxious, but years later, I was invited to speak at Obama's inauguration at the National Inaugural Prayer Service, and I sent him a picture of me afterwards and said, tell me when when we have enough money to hire someone with some gravitas. But anyway, like Obama's okay with this, are you? But anyway, like we learned early on that there were children growing up in our community who thought that I'm what a rabbi looks like.
Right.
Their whole perception is what they see. And so now thankfully, our community has changed, and now there are queer rabbis and there are women rabbis, and like news alert, not all Jews are white people.
Right. Yeah.
20% of our Jewish community is made up of people of color, Black and Asian and Latino. So like the perception of what a Jew looks like and what a rabbi looks like has shifted and expanded. And I feel like the expansion of those boundaries is really for a blessing.
Well, speaking of a blessing, I was very encouraged when Rabbi Choni at Ar Chabad here, he knows I became a Christian in 2000, and yet he still calls me up for Aliyah. And I asked him one time, I said, Choni, you know the whole Jesus thing, right? He said, well, we disagree on Mashiach, but you still have a Jewish face. You can't change your face.
Wow.
So yeah, so there is room even in an Orthodox setting like that. I'm curious. I was curious about something you said at the end of the book. What happens when another person's presence in the sacred circle or at the dinner table not only repels us, but renders us unsafe? When
Mhm.
is it right to withdraw from the shared space or to protect the space from those who would do harm here? Now, with a diverse community that makes up the congregation of IKAR, I would imagine that there were some very different views that emerged and passions that emerged after October 7th. Is
Mm.
that the case? And if so, how did you How did you make space? Were there conversations? How did you deal with all that?
Yeah, so I guess this is really the heart of your podcast, Corey. I
Yeah.
mean, I think this is the heart of your work, which is, how do we not break?
Yeah.
How do our families not break? How do our communities not break? How does this country not break? And so here I'll just I'm going to give you a rabbinic answer, which is by which I mean I'm going to tell you a story, um, which is that in that Mishnah that we started with, that describes that sacred pilgrimage, it's not only the brokenhearted who turn to the left, it's also the ostracized. The ostracized, which is called the menudeh in Hebrew, is somebody who's been punished by the community for causing grave harm to either individuals or the entire community. And when you're ostracized, you are not allowed within 6 feet. They had to socially distance from the community. You don't go to Shabbat dinner. You don't go to the book group, right? You aren't in the supermarket with everybody else. And so, but yet they're there in the holiest place on the holiest days, and they turn to the left like the brokenhearted. And when they do, they're met by somebody coming from the right. And that person looks them in the eye, just like they do the brokenhearted person. And they ask them, Malakh, tell me about your heart. Now, imagine asking that question to somebody who has caused you profound pain because of an Instagram post, because of a phone call that they failed to make to check in on you when you were not well or when your community wasn't well, because they didn't do the right thing, because they've actually said something really damaging or hurtful or worse, right? So not looking away, but looking at them and saying, I'm curious. Tell me about you. What do you see from your vantage point? Tell me about your broken heart. And then the person answers saying, I've been ostracized from this community, which means I actually did something wrong. And then you respond by blessing them, by saying, may the community come to accept you again one day and welcome you back. Or may you come to understand the way you've hurt this community so that you can change and one day be welcome back. Either way, they get a blessing. So what I learned from this is that it's exactly the people who we are, again, disinclined from. We want to retreat from these people, not in this case because they've experienced loss or because they're lonely or because their divorce scares us, but because they've hurt us. They've caused us pain. And instead of pulling away from them, we turn toward them and we do it with curiosity and compassion. We say, can you tell me what you see from your vantage point? How do you understand this terrible war? How do you understand the last 15 months? How do you understand, the response, what's going on the campuses? How do you understand, like this last most recent election and what it's going to mean for our community? And so what we try to do is train ourselves in curiosity and wonder. We try to train ourselves to actually be curious about one another instead of screaming at each other and cursing and running away. And it's a practice that I've really tried to take on over the years. And I've had some really hard conversations with people, often not, it feels like a waste of time afterwards, even though in my heart, I know it's not a waste of my time. But sometimes something beautiful comes out of these conversations and we're able to learn about each other. And sometimes when you learn about the other, it actually helps you learn about yourself too. So you're totally right. I mean, not everybody in this community or in any community sees everything the same way.
Yeah. You go through the practices at the end of the book, and the last one is practice staying at the table.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Practice staying at the table, like just instead of saying, I can't be in the room with this guy,
Yeah.
saying instead, I'm so curious about your relationship to that movement that I feel is causing so much pain to people I love. Can you share a little bit what you see in that? And this is a conversation that I actually just had it was less than a week after the election, and I flew to DC for a conference to give a speech. And I was in the airport on the way out. And I happened to be on the same plane with 30 teenagers who were all wearing hats with the other team on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was so upset. And first I just like texted my husband saying, "Oh my God, can you believe it?" And then I realized like maybe I should be curious.
Right.
And so I asked them like, "Hey, can I ask you a question? Can you tell me a little bit about the hat and this movement and like what do you see in this guy? Like why what draws you to a person who speaks and behaves the way this guy does?" And they answered me. And I have to say, I heard things that I had never thought of. I
Right.
saw, I mean, they didn't change my mind and I didn't change theirs, but we talked for 90 minutes. 90 minutes, a group of 30 kids wearing those hats in the middle of Dallas and me in the middle. And at some point, I mean, I just kept asking and asking and saying, I want to learn more. Like, so tell me what you mean by that. And how do you think that you're perceived by some of the vulnerable communities in this country, including people right around us in this airport, including me, people who feel very threatened by these policies and promises and by this administration? How does it feel for you to be wearing the sign of that on the outside, saying you identify with a movement that threatens our dignity and threatens our rights? And have you thought about that? And they hadn't thought about that actually. And most of those kids took their hats off through the course of our
Oh,
conversation.
wow.
They took the hats off. Now, that doesn't mean they don't still support this
Of
person,
course. Yeah.
but it means that they started to recognize, like, oh, it might be causing people pain to see me celebrating something that they think is, really the end of their rights as a person in this country. So I try to practice actually turning toward the person who's caused me pain, whether it's someone I know well or even a stranger, because I do make a habit. Again, a spiritual practice is something you have to make a habit of. So I do tend to go up to strangers and ask them, "Can I ask you about that?" And I'm genuinely curious, Corey. Like, I want to know, what does it mean to you? What do you see in that? And so I found that to be very helpful. My instinct is to run away. And some relationships will not heal. And I will make a distinction here between, and I think we have to learn how to distinguish between what renders us unsafe and what renders us uncomfortable. The quote that you just brought from chapter 8 really is trying to push us to think about this, because there's some conversations that would not be safe for some of us to have, and we shouldn't. And in fact, the menuda, the ostracized one, is not the excommunicated. The excommunicated is one level worse in terms of punishment, and they're not allowed in that room and in that Temple Mount, because they'll blow it up, right? We
Right.
know people who will do that.
Right.
So we have to guard against that. But most everybody, almost
Most.
everybody,
Yeah.
we can be curious about, even people who've hurt us, and we can ask them questions and we might learn from them. And I have to say, I mean, forgive me for saying this, but by the end of 90 minutes with these kids, I had really tender feelings toward them. Like, I didn't hate them. I actually kind of liked them a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the kids said, "Hey, maybe you'll come teach in our school. We love this." And I was like, "Wow, I'm definitely not going to do that, but I love that you wanted me to." And like, that's so sweet. And by the way, this kid said, "We know that all of our teachers hate this guy too, but
Mm.
they never ask us, what do you see in him?" We don't
Yeah.
ask. And so if you can be safe, what might you learn and what seed might you plant if you actually turn to the person whose views hurt you and ask with genuine curiosity, I really want to know more. Are you willing to share?
Yeah. Are you familiar with Monty Guzman's work? She wrote a book called I Never Thought of It That Way. I think it came out almost exactly 2 years ago. She's
No.
with Braver Angels. Oh, it's an easy read. She makes it very accessible. She's a brilliant writer. She started out as a journalist. I think she's still writing. Monica Guzman. Um, and it's called I Never Thought of It That Way. And a lot of I think David actually cites some of her work in his book from last year. Um, but that's leading with a radical curiosity. And you're already inhabiting a lot of the practices that she recommends, one of which is to lead with a curiosity that allows the possibility for you to come to a conclusion of, oh, I never thought of it that way,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah,
some of it is storytelling. Some of it is asking the person to tell, which you did, asking the person to tell their story. At what point jump on the Trump train, and what was it? What was it that really got you on board with that? Opening the person up to telling their story, because then that person is not just one data point that you create an entire narrative around. They're a
that's right.
human being,
They're
right?
a human being. You're unflattening them, right? You're like
Yeah.
you're giving them back their humanity. And actually, something so special that happened in this conversation was one of the boys turned to me at one point and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What did you see in her?" And I was like, "Thank you so much for asking me that." And I said, "I was at the DNC in the summer and I was overwhelmed with the feeling that this movement was part of a redemption story for America. I felt that for a country that was built by the hands of enslaved people, that elevating to the presidency a Black woman would be an extraordinary redemptive turn to our story. And it made me feel like healing was possible. And for me, as a Jew and as a rabbi, that's such a profoundly spiritual and important journey and story to tell. And I was completely swept up in that narrative. So that's just one thing. And the boy said, "Thank you for sharing that." And I thought, like, okay, that's something. Like, I was so moved that he asked. He didn't ask for the first maybe 40 minutes, but he asked and he heard me. And so I don't know. I mean, it's not gonna solve all of our problems here. Like, as I say in the book, that really gracious quest to understand another person does not take the place of the need for just policy and for just laws and for, a real movement to protect those who are most vulnerable. And it is also essential to whatever kind of just future we might imagine. We have to see people in the fullness of their humanity. And we don't lose anything when we do. I'm still me. I still hold all my same views that I held before and same commitments. But now I see them as a little bit less of a caricature.
There's a story about two salt granules. One is an older salt granule and one is a younger salt. I wonder if I've ever shared this illustration on the show before. And the younger salt granule is like future tripping. He sees what's happening. The salt shaker gets shaken, and their friends go in this boiling thing, and they're never to be seen or heard from again. And the young salt granule tells the wise salt granule, "Hey, this is terrible. We're going to be shaken into this boiling pot and we'll never be seen or heard from again." And the old wise salt granule says, "Yes, that is true. But just think about this. When you go into that soup," he knew it was soup. "When you go into the soup will never be the same again." So it reminds me of you reminded me of that story because a lot of times we think we can enter into a conversation and change somebody's opinion by 180 degrees. But what we're doing is we're affecting each other by 1 degree. That's
Mm,
really what we're doing. And the irony and the poetry in that is that when we even have the opportunity to have 1 degree of influence, it's when we have the openness to be influenced by 1 degree. It's not you're not going to put on your MAGA hat and go go to Trump rallies or anything like that. But the fact that you have a tenderness for some of the folks that you met and spoke with, that is that 1 degree. And the soup that you entered into will never be the same again, right?
right. That's right.
So
That's
there,
right.
yeah, go ahead.
And I share in the book a couple of stories of times where those little interactions do end up being seeds that are planted that end up being transformative.
Yeah.
And, I think that like I mean, this is how change happens.
Mhm.
People connect with people and they see the humanity in one another. And that opens us up to hearing perspectives that we didn't hear before. And I think especially when we're talking about groups of people that have been dehumanized in our time, that when people, see their humanity, it has to change them, right? I share in the story this one incredible story about a congregant of mine named Hannah, who grew up gay and Orthodox. And it's so she goes to Jerusalem for her niece's bat mitzvah some years ago, and she and her wife are there at the Pride Parade in Jerusalem when Shira Bunky, who's a young teenage girl and an ally to the LGBTQ community, is murdered by a Jewish religious extremist. He stabs her in the back at the Pride Parade. This guy had been imprisoned for 10 years and got out of prison that morning because 10 years earlier, he had tried to murder someone at the Pride Parade. He got out of prison, went to the Pride Parade, and killed a kid.
Wow.
My congregant was there. She was 10 feet away. So she was completely traumatized. And she goes to the Shabbat dinner for her niece's bat mitzvah. And she happens to be seated across the table from an old family friend who's become a Jewish religious extremist. And he is more angry about the desecration of the holy city by the Pride Parade than he is by the murder of a child. And she's like, I can't be at the table. This is where the spiritual practice comes from. I can't be at the table. I can't be at the table. And she desperately wants to get up and leave. But then she starts to get curious about him. And she says, what happened to this guy? He used to be a sweet kid. I remember him from my childhood. Who got to him? Does he really believe the things he's saying? How does a person break like this? And she just sits the whole meal staring at his face, asking herself these questions. And then she stands up and she gives a blessing to her niece. And she says, you are living in a time and place in which violence and extremism are becoming the rule of the day. You have to hold love. You have to remember that your inheritance, your Torah inheritance, is love and grace and compassion. And the world needs you to embody that. He hears her say that. A few days later, this guy, who she never has a one-on-one interaction with, calls the family and says, I'm upside down. I just spent Shabbat with a lesbian. And she was amazing. And she had some really good Torah. And so he can't figure out, it makes no sense in his worldview.
Right.
And he literally leaves the settlement that he lives in and moves back into Israel. And the next year, he's at the Pride Parade,
Wow.
marching in the Pride Parade. And, and Hannah says, what I achieved was not getting up from the table. What I achieved was staying curious enough about him that I was able to sit there. And he attributes this whole transformation that he's gone through to her and to the experience of being in the room. Now, she could have left, but if she had left the room, he never would have heard her. Now, Hannah shared that story with me. I closed the manuscript. She gave me permission to share it in my book. I closed the manuscript. And a few months later is the Pride Parade in Jerusalem again. And Hannah called me up and she said, open the paper. And literally, guy who's the cover picture of the Pride Parade, he's wearing a rainbow kippah, rainbow yarmulke. He's holding a trans flag. He's holding a baby on his shoulders, a little toddler who has a sign that says "Love wins," and a little kid an infant in the stroller, and that's the guy. Like he's become the face of the movement of radical inclusion and love. And so I do believe that not every time that we express curiosity and compassion towards someone will it bear out in this transformative way, but it might.
It might. It might. Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time. I do have a lot more questions. Maybe we'll save the story about hate at first sight for another time, but I'm dying to hear that story. But I do want to ask you that what's called the TP&R question. We've already been talking about a lot of this, but I'd love for you to put a pin on it. The TP&R question is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
It is possible, and it's everything that we've just been saying. We have to be curious about each other. We have to see each other as broken-hearted human beings. We have to meet sorrow with sorrow. We are not the only ones who are hurt. We are not the only ones who are scared. We are not the only ones who are struggling to navigate this time of great uncertainty and trauma. We have to be willing to see the pain in each other's hearts and to get curious about it. And I really believe that that is the only way that we're going to be able to navigate this time, along with really like remembering that it's our responsibility to protect each other.
Mm.
It's becoming more and more clear who exactly will be on the front lines of this of the fight of the next many years. We have to protect our neighbors. We have to be of service to each other. We have to engage each other deeply, each other's fears deeply. I mean, I think that there's going to be um, a lot of room for us to be our bravest selves in the coming years, and we're going to need to lead with that. It takes courage to be curious about somebody else, especially somebody who's hurt you. It takes courage to be of service, especially when you feel bereft yourself. It takes courage to protect someone else when you feel unsafe. And I think we're going to have to do all of those things.
Second to last question. Do you have any questions for me?
I have so many questions for you, Corey. I'm curious about your journey to Christianity. I want to understand how that what compelled you and what you find there.
Well, it was a long road to that. What I will say that the one of the last parts of the story before I prayed a very clumsy prayer, because in Judaism we have a prayer for everything, and I wasn't used to this, improvisational just talk to God thing. But before I did that, one of the last things that happened was I finally read the New Testament. And the first book that I read was the book of James, and that letter starts with to the 12 tribes. So it was very interesting. It spoke directly to me, and James deals with a couple of the theological issues that I was grappling with, faith versus works, kind of a thing that was new to me as I was considering Christianity, grappling with some of the concepts. But then when I went to the beginning of the collection, and I started in Matthew and just started reading right through, only 5 chapters in, I came across what I recognized. I didn't know what it was at the time, but what I recognized it as was a Devar Torah. Jesus giving one of the most brilliant Devar Torahs I'd ever read or heard, and it was the Sermon on the Mount. That's why I didn't put two and two together. I just wasn't familiar with it on a literary standpoint that way. And it just pulled me into the entire collection. By the time I got to Revelation 22, I thought that Yeshua ben Yosef was Mashiach. And I took that step. And that was 20 something years ago. You can imagine the conversation I had with my father
Mhm.
that Thanksgiving
Mhm.
morning. And it's a conversation that started in a very fraught way and was very heated at times, especially those first 3 or 4 years. But it's a conversation that continued. He won't own up to this, but my mother tells me that he did consider sitting Shiva for me when I first told him. But he came to the profound conclusion that his relationship with his son was more important than
Mm.
his convictions of this decision that I'd made. So we just stayed in the conversation. Now he and I have actually very similar views on who this historical person was, although he still thinks that Jesus was not Messiah. So he came to uh, important distinctions there, but there's more to the story than that. I had been exposed in the prior seasons of the spring and summer leading up to that fall when I finally read the New Testament to G.K. Chesterton's work, C.S. Lewis's work, some other apologetics that frankly I didn't find as compelling as some of the theological arguments that Henri Nouwen was making, that Chesterton was making. But like I said, I don't want to go too deep into it because I've shared some of the story on the show before. But I thought you'd appreciate those last parts, recognizing the Sermon on the Mount, which I didn't know was the Sermon on the Mount, more as a brilliant Devar Torah. So
Yeah, yeah, it really is one of the best.
yeah, yeah.
It is.
So I'm glad to hear you say that. So yeah, I mean,
Oh, it's a great sermon. I mean,
yeah,
there's a unquestionable.
yeah. And by the way, so in Matthew 23, I'm curious if you ever read that chapter, it's basically a fight that Jesus is having with the Pharisees, but I just recognize it as Tuesday dinner. Like it's like Jews this is what we do. We argue with each other,
What we
you
do.
know. Um, but be so much more to talk about. But before we go, how can we follow you, find more information about IKAR, the Amen Effect, your wonderful book, and all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you so much, Corey. And the book is really I think the best place to start, and the website is ikar.org, IKAR.org. And we post all of our sermons every week and a lot of other teachings and things that are going on. And folks are always welcome to come join us in person too, like you have. And I hope we'll get to see you again. I'm so grateful to you for having these conversations. I think this is really critical. It's such a tough time, and it's really important for us to realize that we do have some tools to help navigate even the most difficult moments.
We do. We do. I think if you do come across Monty Guzman's work, I think you'll find that her book, I never thought of it that way, really edifying. But thank you so much for spending the time with me. I do look forward to seeing you, and I'll bring Lisa to a service here sometime in the next few weeks. And yeah, thanks. This is really nice.
Thanks so much, Corey.
You bet. You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review, and you can watch the conversations on YouTube, support us on Patreon. All this stuff is in the show notes. Your support really does make a difference. So thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.